Chapter 1, The Holographic Dawn. The glow of neon lights flickered above, casting long shadows across the rain-slick streets of New Arcadia. A city of glass and steel, it was a place where dreams came to die. The sky, perpetually obscured by smog and clouds, offered no comfort. There were no stars, no sun, just the hum of machines, the droning noise of airships overhead, and the thrum of life too tightly packed in the urban sprawl. Lena Rook stood on the edge of a rooftop, her eyes fixed on the city below, her fingers twitching at the edge of her gloves. A hacker by trade, a rebel by necessity. At only 24, she had seen more of the underbelly of the world than most citizens would in a lifetime. The corporations that controlled the megacities had built a cage for the people. A cage where everyone was a number, a cog in the machine, and dissent was punished with the kind of finality that made even the bravest minds second guess. "Rook, you're up," came the familiar voice of Caden, her handler, crackling over her earpiece. Lena's fingers brushed against the sleek surface of her wristband, an old piece of technology that had been modified with her own modifications. A small piece of rebellion to fight against the empire of order. "Ready." "What's the drop?" "A cargo lift at Sector 17, Caden replied. "We've intercepted intel. The government's been moving something big, something old. We think it's the artifact. Get there and secure it. We don't know how much longer it'll be." The artifact. The artifact was the stuff of myth, whispered about in hidden corners of the rebel underground. A relic of the alien species known as the Elythians who had once visited Earth, before disappearing. No one knew what happened to them, only that their technology was advanced beyond imagination. It was said that this artifact had the power to change the future. And now it was close. Too close. Lena adjusted the straps of her backpack, feeling the weight of the task ahead. "I'm on my way." As she sprinted across the rooftops, her mind raced. She had always been skeptical of the artifact's true power, dismissing it as a legend used to rally people into action. But the rebel faction, the Echoes, had been working toward finding it for years. They believed it was the key to breaking the stranglehold the government had on Earth. Her pulse quickened as she approached the lift shaft in Sector 17. The cargo lift was just ahead, hidden in the shadows of a decrepit warehouse. It was risky, but Lena thrived on risk. She ducked into an alley, her body blending with the darkened corners of the city. The lift was just a few meters away. She could hear the mechanical hum of its system, and the faint sound of distant voices, likely guards keeping watch. She paused, scanning the area. Through her augmented vision, the world around her shifted into a grid of data, overlaying the physical structures. She located the lift controls and mapped the trajectory of the guard patrols, noting their timing. "Piece of cake," she whispered under her breath. With a fluid motion, Lena darted across the street and slid into the shadows next to the lift's access panel. Her fingers danced across the control pad, bypassing the encrypted code with ease. In seconds she had it open. A low mechanical whir echoed as the lift's large metallic doors slid open. She slid inside, her heart beating in sync with the hum of the elevator as it began to descend. The cargo hold was massive, filled with crates marked with the emblem of the World Authority, an oppressive, all-encompassing force that governed every aspect of life. But it was one crate that caught her eye. It was slightly larger than the others, and for all the secrecy surrounding it, it had no labels. No insignia. The crate was nearly impossible to move with just her hands, but Lena wasn't just anyone. She was part of the Echoes for a reason. She attached a small handheld device to the crate and punched a few quick commands into her wristband. There was a sharp hiss, and the crate's locks disengaged. With a deep breath, Lena opened the crate. What she saw inside made her freeze. The object was unlike anything she had ever seen. A sphere, smooth, metallic, but pulsating with light. It wasn't just a piece of technology. It was alive in a way. Its surface shimmered like liquid, a deep iridescent blue that seemed to shift with every movement. But it wasn't the beauty of it that held her in place. It was the feeling. The sensation of pure raw energy that radiated from the sphere, pulling her in like a magnet. Lena hesitated, her mind whirling. She'd been briefed on the artifact, but this was something different. It wasn't just a tool, a relic, it felt like it was waiting for her. Before she could make a decision, the soft click of footsteps echoed in the distance. "Shit," Lena muttered, her heart pounding in her chest. She was almost out of time. In a split-second decision, Lena grabbed the sphere and tucked it under her arm, leaping toward the lift controls. The doors slid shut just as two guards appeared at the far end of the corridor, but Lena was already moving up, the lift accelerating toward the surface. Her mind raced. What have I just unleashed? Screen, Caden's message blinking. Did you get it? She didn't answer right away. She stared at the shimmering object in her hands, the hum of its energy filling the space around her. A strange warmth began to rise from the artifact, like a whisper just beneath the surface of her thoughts. It was almost as if it knew she was holding it. Yeah, Lena finally answered. I got it. And as the lift rose into the night, a new chapter of her life was about to begin. A chapter that would lead her into the heart of a war she had never seen coming. Chapter 2, The Echoes of Time. Lena didn't bother waiting for the lift to reach the surface before she sprang into action. Her instincts kicked in, guiding her movements as she slid the artifact into the specially designed compartment on her backpack. The energy of it still pulsed against her back, like a second heartbeat. It was unnerving, but she couldn't afford to hesitate. She needed to get back to the safe house and fast. When the lift finally arrived at the surface, Lena slipped out into the alley, moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent most of their life blending into shadows. The city around her was a maze of darkened streets and flickering lights, the air thick with the acrid scent of industrial pollution. Her mind raced as she formulated a plan to navigate through the streets unnoticed. The government's surveillance drones patrolled every corner of the city, and getting caught would mean the end of the line. She checked her wristband, which flashed a new set of coordinates, her rendezvous point with Caden. She had no time to waste. The last thing she needed was a delay. Lena ducked into an alley, one of many crisscrossing the decaying sprawl of New Arcadia. The low hum of the city seemed to vibrate through the concrete beneath her boots. It was late, well past curfew, which meant the streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional patrolling officer or stray civilian. But as she turned a corner, something caught her eye, a flicker in the shadows. Her muscles tensed. A figure appeared, stepping out from the darkness, blocking her path. He wore the long black coat of the government's enforcers, the World Authority soldiers. His face was obscured by a reflective mask, but she could see the sharp angles of his body language. He wasn't just a guard, he was a predator. He had been waiting for her. You've got something, the man said, his voice calm but cutting through the air like a blade. Hand it over. Lena's heart slammed against her ribs. It wasn't possible. She'd been careful. Too careful. She hadn't been followed. Not that she knew of. But then again, the World Authority had resources, eyes everywhere. The man took a step forward, his hand reaching for a device at his belt. It was a pulse gun, a silent weapon that could render a person unconscious in an instant. It wasn't lethal, but it wasn't something she wanted to experience. And she definitely didn't want to be caught. Who are you? She demanded, her voice low but steady, her hand inching toward the hidden compartment in her backpack. Does it matter? He replied with an unsettling smirk, not breaking eye contact. You've got something that doesn't belong to you, and it's time we take it back. Lena had no choice. She pulled the artifact from her bag and held it out, the cool metallic sphere gleaming in the dim light of the alley. Her fingers hovered just above it, ready to use her last card. If you think this is just some trinket, she said, her voice steady, you're about to find out how wrong you are. The figure paused, his eyes flickering with something like recognition. But it was too late. She wasn't here to negotiate. She wasn't here to be caught. With a sharp movement, Lena activated the small device in her wristband, and the artifact's surface began to shimmer. The light around them seemed to bend and stretch, distorting like ripples across water. A hum filled the air, louder and louder, until it reached a crescendo. Then everything stopped. Time. Or something like it. The world around Lena turned to stillness. She could still hear the distant hum of the city, the faint sound of the man's breath, but everything around them had frozen. Even the droplets of rain that had been falling through the air were suspended, each one hanging in place. Lena didn't hesitate. She bolted forward, her boots slapping against the wet pavement as she dashed past the frozen figure. She didn't know how long she had, minutes, maybe seconds, but she couldn't afford to waste time. She reached the end of the alley, skidding into the main street. The artifact. It had done something. Something beyond her comprehension. She didn't look back. An hour later, Lena arrived at the safe house, a rundown building in the heart of District 13, tucked between two larger structures. The door creaked open as she entered, and she quickly locked it behind her. Her nerves were still shot from the encounter in the alley. She didn't know what the artifact had done, but she couldn't afford to take chances. The safe house was sparse. A few old chairs, a rickety table, and the faint smell of dust and rust. It wasn't much, but it was home for the echoes. Caden, she called out, her voice barely more than a whisper. A figure appeared from the shadows, his silhouette tall and lean. Caden was in his late 20s with a sharp face and piercing green eyes that always seemed to be calculating, always planning. Got it, Lena said, her voice shaking slightly as she removed the artifact from her bag. Caden didn't move right away. He stared at the object, his eyes widening with a mixture of awe and fear. Is that? He trailed off, his voice hushed. Yeah. That's it, she replied, her fingers brushing the cool surface of the artifact again. She could still feel the energy pulsing from it, vibrating under her skin. He stepped forward, his gaze locked on it. It's more than we thought. We're not ready for this. Lena didn't respond. She didn't have the answers. She was still trying to make sense of what had happened. She hadn't meant to stop time, at least she didn't think she had. You did well, Caden said after a long pause. But the clock's ticking. We need to get it to headquarters. The longer we wait, the more dangerous it becomes. Lena shook her head. I don't think we can use it like that. I triggered something. It froze time. Everything around us. It just stopped. I don't know what's happening. Caden didn't seem surprised. You felt it, didn't you? The power? Lena nodded slowly. It's alive. It's not just some artifact. It's something else. Exactly, Caden said, his tone more serious than before. And that's why we need to move fast. Every use of it chips away at the timeline. It's been hidden for a reason. Lena looked at the artifact again, her unease growing. What happens if we keep using it? Caden met her gaze, his eyes hard. We're not just altering the future. We're rewriting it. And eventually the timeline will break. And when it does, everything will collapse. The only question is when. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She had just taken the first step into a storm she couldn't understand. The artifact wasn't just a weapon, it was a ticking bomb. And they were running out of time. Chapter 3, Shattered Futures. Lena stared at the artifact, her mind spinning. She had always been one of the best, one of the fastest, in the underground network of hackers and operatives. She could crack security systems, infiltrate high-risk zones, and disappear without leaving a trace. But this was different. The artifact wasn't just a tool to be used. It was a force that could rip apart the very fabric of reality. How many times have you used it? Lena asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Caden shook his head. This is the first time it's been activated in over a decade, but we've known of its existence for much longer. The echoes have always kept it hidden, as much from the government as from ourselves. We're not sure if anyone fully understands how it works. Only that it's dangerous. Lena frowned. What do you mean dangerous? If we can control it, we can't, Caden interrupted, his voice sharper than usual. We think we can control it, but that's the problem. Every time we manipulate the timeline, it creates ripples. The smallest change can alter everything. It's like the timeline is a web, and the artifact is a stone thrown into it. The longer we use it, the more fragile the web becomes. She bit her lip, trying to process the information. The artifact could change everything. The future. The past. The present. It was the key to breaking the government's hold on Earth, but at what cost? Lena's mind flashed to the alleyway, to the moment when time had frozen around her. The tension, the crackling energy in the air, it was as if she had reached into something far beyond her understanding. She hadn't meant to stop time. She just reacted like she always did. But now she was realizing that every instinct she'd honed for years might not be enough for what was coming. You said the timeline will break if we keep using it, Lena said, still holding the artifact in her hands, as if its very presence might change everything again. What do you mean by that? Caden stepped closer, his gaze intense. The artifact was created by an alien race, the Elythians. They were far ahead of us technologically, and they understood time in a way we can't even begin to comprehend. When they left Earth, they left the artifact behind as a safeguard, a tool to help or perhaps control the timeline. But it's not without consequences. The more it's used, the more unstable the future becomes. Eventually, the threads of time will snap. Snap? Lena repeated, her stomach sinking. She could barely comprehend the gravity of what he was saying. You mean, what happens if we break it? What happens to us? Caden looked at her, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes that made her question everything. A flicker of fear. We lose everything. The timeline could unravel. The past, the present, the future, all of it might merge together into one. We wouldn't just lose our futures. We'd lose ourselves. Our memories, our identities, they could disappear entirely. Lena felt her pulse quicken. It was too much. It was all too much. She had always lived her life in the shadows, taking on the government, fighting for a cause that felt bigger than herself. But now, this was no longer about hacking into systems or stealing information. This was about reality itself. About the survival of the entire human race. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Caden exhaled slowly, his gaze flicking over the artifact once more. "We can't use it recklessly. Every time it activates, it leaves a trace. The government will be looking for us, looking for that. It's only a matter of time before they realize what we have. And when they do, they won't just send soldiers. They'll send everything. And they'll tear this city apart to get it." A wave of dread washed over Lena. They weren't just on the run from a few guards anymore. They were being hunted by something far larger, far more dangerous than she had ever faced. "We need to figure out what it wants," Caden continued, his voice steady despite the urgency in the air. "The artifact isn't just a weapon, it's a key. If we can learn to understand it, we might be able to control the future. If we don't, it'll control us. And the timeline will be lost to chaos." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their consequences. Lena thought about the frozen moment in the alley, the split second when the world had been suspended, when she had felt the pulse of the artifact inside her, like it was reaching out to her. Maybe she could understand it. Maybe she could learn to wield its power. But could anyone really control something like that? "I have to go," Caden said abruptly, pulling her from her thoughts. "We need to get to the safe house. I'll contact the others. We can't let this fall into the wrong hands." "Not yet." Lena nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. The artifact had done something to her. She could still feel the hum of its energy, like a whisper that tugged at her thoughts. She wasn't just holding the artifact. It was holding her too. The connection was deeper than she could explain. She couldn't ignore it, not when it was calling her, pulling at the edges of her mind. Caden was already heading for the door, but Lena paused, her hand resting on the artifact one last time. "You sure we're ready for this?" she asked, the words tasting strange on her tongue. Caden glanced back at her. His eyes were distant, but there was a flicker of something else, something that felt like hope. "We don't have a choice. If we don't stop the government from getting it first, we'll lose everything. We'll lose ourselves. And that's a fate worse than death." The streets outside were empty. But Lena knew better than to trust the silence. The city may have been quiet, but it was never safe. She glanced at the artifact again, her fingers trailing over its smooth surface. The power was there, pulsing beneath her fingertips, and something deep inside her stirred. Was she ready for this? Could she wield the power of time itself without losing herself? She didn't have the answers. But she had to find them. Because the future, her future, was no longer in her hands. It was in the hands of the artifact. And time was running out. Chapter 4, The Edge of Collapse. The safe house was dark, the only light coming from a flickering screen in the corner. The air smelled of stale coffee and old wood, a scent that had become as familiar to Lena as the hum of the city outside. She sat at the battered table, the artifact resting beside her, a silent weight that seemed to grow heavier the longer she stared at it. The others hadn't arrived yet, but Lena didn't feel the usual relief that came with their presence. Something was different. The room felt too quiet, the shadows too long. Every corner of the safe house seemed to pulse with anticipation, as though the building itself was waiting for something to happen. And she couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before something broke. Her thoughts were interrupted by a low crackle from her wristband. "Caden," she said, tapping the device to activate the communication. "We've got a problem," his voice crackled through. "The government's tightening their grip on the city. They've dispatched a special task force to locate us. We're not the only ones hunting the artifact anymore. There's a new player in the game." Lena stiffened. "Who?" Caden paused for a beat. "I don't know exactly. But they're not government agents. They're something else. They're organized, well-funded. And they have access to tech we've never seen before." The cold knot in Lena's stomach tightened. If there was anyone who could move fast enough to beat the government to the artifact, it was a group like this. "What should we do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "Don't move. Stay where you are. We need to regroup. I'll get the others to you soon. In the meantime, keep an eye on the artifact. Don't let it out of your sight." Lena's fingers brushed against the smooth surface of the artifact. She didn't need to be told twice. The connection she felt to it was growing stronger with each passing minute. It was almost as if it was calling to her, sending out pulses of energy through her fingertips, a gentle but insistent tug on her senses. "I won't," Lena said, her voice barely more than a whisper. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Be careful, Rook." The line went dead, and Lena was left alone with the weight of his warning. An hour passed, the tension in the air almost unbearable. Lena paced the room, her mind running through all the possible scenarios. Every sound in the building seemed amplified in the silence. The faint click of her boots on the floor, the rustle of her jacket, the low whir of the artifact's energy, it was all too much. The artifact had been silent for the past few minutes, but Lena could still feel its presence. The vibrations were subtle, almost imperceptible. But there, under her skin. She placed her hand on the smooth surface again, this time with more purpose, as if reaching out to it. The hum of energy seemed to grow, resonating in her bones. The world around her shifted. For a brief moment, Lena felt it, something that was not just the artifact's power but something else, something alive within it. A presence, almost like a voice, but silent. It was old, ancient, and it was watching her. She could feel it, the weight of its gaze, as if it was waiting for something from her. The pulse of the artifact sharpened, a steady rhythm that almost felt like a heartbeat. Then suddenly the silence broke. A sharp, metallic noise echoed from the hallway outside. Footsteps. Rapid. Too rapid. Lena's heart pounded in her chest. She grabbed the artifact, tucking it under her arm. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she held her ground. There was no time to escape. She had to wait for Caden and the others, to trust they would be there soon. Another noise, this time the unmistakable hiss of a door opening. Lena took a deep breath, flipping a hidden switch on her wristband that activated a shield around the room. It wouldn't hold for long, but it would give her some time. She moved quietly toward the back of the room, her eyes fixed on the shadows. Her pulse was steady now, every muscle in her body attuned to the slightest sound. She could hear them now, creeping closer, footsteps muffled against the concrete floor. At least 2. Maybe 3. The door to the safe house creaked open, and the silhouette of a figure emerged into the dim light. Lena tensed, waiting. Then the door slid shut with a sharp click. The figure was dressed in black like the government enforcers, but this man wore no insignia. His movements were deliberate, calculating. Not an enforcer. Not a soldier. Lena narrowed her eyes. There was something familiar about the man's gait, the way he moved with quiet precision. It was unsettling. It felt like she had seen him before, but where? Then, without warning, his voice echoed in the empty space of the room. "I know you're here, Rook." Lena froze. She'd been found. The man took another step forward, and as he did, the shadows seemed to shift around him, clinging to his form like liquid darkness. He stepped into the light, revealing his face. It was the eyes that struck her first, cold, calculating, and unervingly familiar. She felt the chill run down her spine, but it wasn't fear. It was something else. Something much worse. "Long time no see," the man said with a dark smile. Lena's throat went dry. Or should I say, sister? Chapter 5, The Last Hour. Lena's breath caught in her throat. Her hand tightened around the artifact, the cool metal pressing against her palm, but it was no longer enough to ground her. She'd heard stories about the lost ones, the rogue operatives who had disappeared without a trace, but she never thought she'd be face to face with one of them, especially not someone who shared her blood. The man's smile was chilling, his eyes gleaming with a cold intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "Sister," he repeated, his voice low and smooth like he was savoring the word. "Did you forget? Or did you think you could escape it?" Lena shook her head, trying to push the words away, trying to make sense of the situation. This can't be real. But every part of her knew it was. She could see the resemblance now, the same sharp jawline, the same piercing eyes. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, and she could feel the truth settling over her like a weight. "No," Lena said, her voice steady despite the rising panic. "You're not my brother. I don't know who you are, but you're not family." His smile only grew wider, like he found her defiance amusing. "I never said I was family," he replied. "But I was created to be something you'd never understand. I'm just another experiment. A test. Like you?" Lena's pulse quickened. "An experiment? What are you talking about? You really don't remember, do you?" He took a step forward, his eyes locked onto her with a dangerous gleam. "The Elythians didn't just leave behind the artifact. They left behind us, the ones they tried to perfect. You and I, Lena, we were both made for something much bigger than the lives we've lived. We are their legacy." The truth hit her like a wave. She could feel it, a jagged edge to his words, cutting through the fog of confusion that had clouded her mind for years. An experiment. Created. The pieces of her past, the things that didn't quite add up, were suddenly falling into place. She had always wondered why she didn't fit in, why she'd been different. But she never imagined this. "You're one of them," Lena breathed, finally understanding. One of the Elythian experiments. But you turned on them. You're working with the government? He chuckled softly. I'm not working with anyone. I am above them. And you? You're nothing more than a pawn. You think you can control the artifact. You think you can change the future. His eyes flashed with malice. But you can't, Lena. The artifact is just a tool. The true power is within us. The only thing left to do is decide who gets to control the future. Me, or the ones who'll destroy it all. Lena's mind raced. Everything she had believed about the artifact was unraveling. She had thought it was her key to saving humanity, to changing the future. But now, it seemed like it was a weapon in the hands of someone who had already made up his mind about what that future should look like. You're wrong, she said, the words feeling like they were coming from someone else. You think you can control the timeline, but you don't understand it. You don't understand what happens when you try to change things. It breaks. The man's gaze hardened, his fingers twitching, but he didn't respond. Instead, he pulled a sleek, dark device from his belt, a small, perfectly cylindrical object that hummed with energy. It's already broken, Lena, he said softly. The timeline was never meant to be whole. But the artifact will make it so, and I will be the one to wield it. His hand moved toward the artifact on the table, but Lena was faster. With a single motion, she lunged forward, grabbing the artifact and twisting away from him. No, she shouted. You can't have it. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. Lena's heart raced as she clutched the artifact, feeling the familiar hum of its power pulsing through her, like the very core of the universe vibrating in her hands. But as she looked up at the man standing before her, her brother, she realized the truth of his words. She couldn't stop what had already started. The air around them crackled, charged with energy. He was ready to take the artifact. He was ready to break the timeline, to shape it into whatever twisted future he desired. But Lena had learned something in that fleeting moment, a spark of understanding that had flickered within her when he spoke. The artifact wasn't just about controlling time. It was about being time. It was about seeing the infinite possibilities, the choices, the outcomes, and then choosing what to do with them. With a strength she didn't know she had, Lena activated the artifact again, feeling the power surge through her, wrapping around her like a storm. She wasn't just holding the future anymore, she was becoming it. The world around them bent, twisted, and then exploded into a blinding flash of light. When Lena opened her eyes, the world was silent. The room was empty. Her brother was gone. The artifact had disappeared. For a long moment, Lena just stood there, trying to breathe, trying to steady her racing heart. Her mind was a blur, but one thought cut through the confusion. The timeline, she had reset it. She didn't know how, but in that moment she had erased everything. The choices, the events, the people. The future was no longer fixed. She had stopped it from breaking, at least for now. But the consequences were yet to come. She could feel the world shifting, the timeline rippling like water disturbed by a stone. Things were different now. But would they be better? Would they be worse? Lena knew one thing, the fight wasn't over. The government would come. Her brother would come. And the artifact, whatever it was, would always be waiting for someone to claim it. But as she stood alone in the empty room, the silence of the world pressing down on her, Lena realized something else. She had a choice now. A choice to rebuild. To fight. To live. The future wasn't just an echo of what had been. It was something new. Something she could shape. And for the first time she understood the true power she held in her hands. The battle had only just begun.